Hey, what's up everybody? This is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I'm going to do in this video today is talk about Hume's argument against miracles and where it fails. Now, I call this video Debunking Hume's Argument Against Miracles, and if you've been around my channel at all, you know I don't really like using the word debunking. In part because, for two reasons. First, I think looking at an argument with the goal of debunking it doesn't actually put you in a position to evaluate its merits. But also because I think using words like debunking actually tends to have this connotation that it doesn't have any merit. And that's not how I feel at all. I think Hume's argument against miracles is one of the biggest contributions to human knowledge, period. And I'll justify that claim in a minute. The reason I call this debunking Hume's argument is because I want to point out problems with Hume's argument precisely because I think it has merit and because I think it needs to be strengthened to blossom into the best argument it can be. So by poking at this argument in ways where Hume isn't successful, and I'll talk about 5 reasons why I think Hume is not successful, I'll then talk about how we can resuscitate Hume and potentially Hume can make a stronger case, or the challenges to looking at Hume's argument in light of what we know now. So once again, this debunking is not me claiming Hume's argument is without merit. It is precisely because I like his argument so much. Obviously, I think it fails, but because I think it is such a good contribution that I want to challenge it and hopefully make it stronger. And furthermore, me having issues with Hume's argument is not a knock at all. I'm a fan of Hume. I'm not really a Hume scholar, but I think Hume was a great philosopher and very influential. And I also think his argument against miracles is one of the most legendary arguments in philosophy, and I do not say this lightly. Why do I say this? And why do I say I think it is one of the biggest contributions to human knowledge and philosophy? First of all, because it is still used and debated today. I mean, you hear it all the time, so it has longevity. But more than that, I think because Hume's argument explicitly led to the development of Bayesian statistics, thanks to Reverend Bayes and Richard Price actually responding to Hume's argument, this is the big point. Bayesian statistics is what I use in my research, my scientific research, all the time, every single day. And I don't know if Bayes and Price would have developed Bayesian statistics without Hume's argument or without Hume's prompting them to give a reply. And turns out Hume and Price were actually buddies. I'll have some letters later on that show Hume talking about it, talking about Price's response, and actually really, really interesting. But because of this, Hume asked the right question. And that's, I think, the main point here. It's not whether his argument was right or wrong. It's that he asked or presented an argument that provoked responses that led to useful stuff. And I contrast this with, think about Fermat's last theorem. I have a paper about Fermat's last theorem, which is basically Fermat was probably being a troll and was like, look, I found this easy proof to this theorem, right? And he wrote it in the margin. There's no way he would have done that because it took hundreds of years of mathematics to eventually prove Fermat's last theorem, which wasn't actually done until 20, 30 years ago, 1995, I believe. Doesn't matter whether Fermat was right or wrong in his last theorem. What matters is the fact that he asked the right question that led to development of new mathematics, new branches of mathematics, and led to all these really interesting applications in number theory that may not have been addressed if people weren't trying to prove or disprove Fermat's last theorem. So in a similar way, I consider Hume's argument, even though it is flawed, to have generated good discussion because he asked the right question and was thinking about the right things. The other thing I want to say too, it's very easy with our blinders now and with our knowledge of things like New Atheism to see Hume as this condescending sort of guy. Apparently he was a really nice guy and was apparently very open-minded. This is what the Hume scholars tell me. With that being said, he does start on miracles with an opening that does sound pretty conceited. He's basically like, I think I have found an everlasting check on all sorts of superstition. Kind of funny way to start your essay. We're going to talk about why it fails, but hopefully, once again, with the goal of continuing discussion and not shutting it down. So let's talk a little bit about Hume's argument. So basically, Hume's argument can be summed up like this. Because a miracle would be a violation of the laws of nature, miracles are impossible, or alternatively, one cannot have a justified belief that a miracle occurred. So this deals with ontology and epistemology. Whichever one he's going at, it's unclear actually. And you can make a case for either one, and we'll discuss both. The ontological part, whether miracles are impossible, and or whether one can have a justified belief in miracles occurring, whether or not they do actually occur. I also want to give a thank you before we get going to the YouTuber Testify. He inadvertently recommended Habermas and Devett's collection called In Defense of Miracles. And this book includes an essay by Norman Geisler, which actually inspired my third point that I'm going to talk about. So if I hadn't read that book, this video would only be 4 points long. It includes the original text of Hume, along with Flew's more contemporary steelmanning of Hume's point. Now, I'm not going to talk about Flew's version of the argument for two reasons. The first is just scope and time, but the second is because Flew does really seem to have recounted. He went after his positive views and colleagues later on in his life. There's a book about that, and apparently he was buddies with Habermas, and they discussed a lot of things, so I'm not going to go into that. That perhaps deserves its own video. We're going to talk about Hume's original formulation and what needs to be done to resuscitate Hume's argument. So here are the 5 issues with Hume's argument against miracles. 1, it's question begging, although I think it can be reformulated to not be question begging. 2, it's actually inconsistent with Hume's skepticism within his own work. C.S. Lewis makes this point. 3, it proves too much. This is Norman Geisler's point. Number 4, it was made in reference to an outdated and debunked picture of Newtonian or Laplacian mechanics. And 5, it was made without knowledge of modern Bayesian statistics, probability theory, Bayesian epistemology. I think Hume himself was aware of some of these limitations, at least to a certain extent, especially given his formulation about the problem of induction. So as I was reading this, I noticed this, and then it turns out as I was doing the research for this video, I realized C.S. Lewis actually made this point too and noticed this as well. So not all that surprising. And perhaps to some extent he found Price and Bayes' reply to On Miracles that led to the development of Bayesian statistics somewhat compelling. In particular, he ended his later work, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, with the quote, "To be a philosophical skeptic is, and a man of letters, the first and most essential step towards being a sound believing Christian." Now, it's possible that he meant this to be taken ironically, but as philosopher John Hare argues, this really does go beyond the evidence. So let's go ahead and get going. Let's go ahead and talk about Hume begging the question. George Campbell summarizes it like this, right? Hume rests his case against belief in miracles upon the claim that laws of nature are supported by exceptionless testimony. But testimony can only be accounted exceptionless if we discount the occurrence of miracles. This is pretty much the best summary of the point, so that's why I'm citing Campbell. But there are a lot of other scholars, Ehrman, Lewis, Moreland, Craig, who would agree with this claim that it really is question begging. While some Hume scholars do claim John Ehrman misinterprets Hume, and he has this book called Hume's Abject Failure. I actually agree with the atheist Peter Millican, who's a Hume scholar, in the sense that Hume's argument is flawed in its original state. I don't think I'd even be as harsh as Millican is, but it can be strengthened, and it has merit, and is certainly worth considering. And it can also be made stronger given our current understanding. And Flew does this to a certain extent, but I'm not going to get into this. The other thing I want to say is Peter Millican has a bunch of philosophy lectures on YouTube, which are great. So you should definitely check his videos out. They're really interesting. I used to listen to them while I was walking my dog. So how does Hume beg the question? Let's look at Hume's argument in particular. Lewis says it like this: Hume's proposition that laws of nature cannot be broken is effectively the same question as do miracles occur, and I think Lewis is right here. David Hume defines a miracle as a transgression of a law of nature by a particular violation of the deity or by interposition of some invisible agent. And yet he defines laws of nature as a firm and unalterable experience. And this is why it's question begging. He defines the laws of nature as unalterable in the first place to try to show that miracles are impossible. And as a result, claiming that laws of nature are unalterable is the same as the question, do miracles occur? So if you pre-establish that the laws of nature are unalterable, then the answer of do miracles occur is going to be no, because you've defined the laws of nature as unbreakable, basically. This is what kind of Hume says. Upon the whole, then, it appears that no testimony for any kind of miracle has ever amounted to a probability, much less to a proof, and that, even supposing it amounted to a proof, it would be opposed by another proof, derived from the very nature of fact. It is experience only which gives authority to human testimony, and it is the same experience which assures us of the laws of nature. A couple things I want to point out. The first thing is that our assumption that the regularity of the laws of nature is itself based on human testimony, right? So the only reason we know that such things are the laws of nature outside of our own experience is because we're relying on the testimony of other people saying, yeah, whenever I drop a ball that falls down to the ground, or whenever somebody dies, they stay dead. So what you're doing is you're pitting two versions of human testimony against each other. And this also includes places and weighing in on evidence where there is no human testimony, whether or not a miracle could have existed when nobody was around to potentially view it. And I think in this particular case, this is where Hume sorts of begs a question as well, because he argues that our experience can somehow be extrapolated. He uses human testimony to establish the regularity of the laws of nature, but discounts human testimony when it goes against his case for providing evidence for a miracle. He argues no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any such system of religion. If he's going to make that claim, I think you can say, well, then human testimony can't have enough force to prove that the laws of nature are exceptionless. And the other thing I want to say too, right? Hume's use of the word proof here, or prove, is not what we mean today, given like mathematical proofs or analytic proofs. He's basically saying evidence, or maybe using probability. But as we'll talk about later, his use of the word probability is, I don't want to say flawed, but maybe misguided. And here's another place where he begs a question, right? It is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country, which assumes that it already hasn't happened. It assumes that this hasn't happened to try to prove why we shouldn't trust any future occurrence. And I think this is the problem here, right? He's presupposing that the laws of nature are exceptionless to try to show that we shouldn't trust any sort of miracle claims. Lewis says it like this: probabilities of the kind Hume is concerned with hold inside the framework of an assumed uniformity of nature, laws of nature. When the question of miracles is raised, we are asking about the validity or perfection of the frame itself. No study of probabilities inside a given frame can ever tell us how probable it is that the frame itself can be violated. This goes into Bayes' rule onto conditional probability, where we talk about the fact that yes, you can't establish the probability that something will be violated if you're talking about something outside of the actual box or the frame of reference that you have itself. And this is where you can't necessarily use the uniformity to provide necessarily evidential support for something outside of that frame of reference, which is, once again, Lewis is saying. Now I want to talk about Hume's inconsistency. Lewis says it like this: the odd thing is no man knew this better than Hume. His essay on miracles is quite inconsistent with the more radical and honorable skepticism of his main work. So Hume is known for being a skeptic. It's odd that Hume mentions the problem of induction, given that he tries to use induction against the case of miracles. Hume says it like this: from all inferences from experience suppose, as their foundation, that the future will resemble the past, and that similar powers will be conjoined with similar sensible qualities. If there be any suspicion that the course of nature may change, and that the past may be no rule for the future, all experience becomes useless and can give rise to no inference or conclusion. It is impossible, therefore, that any arguments from experience can prove this resemblance of the past to the future. And likewise, this comes literally from the same work. Hume is recognizing that just because things have happened a certain way in the past doesn't give us a reason to believe that they will basically behave that way in the future. And as a result, you could also argue the other way around. You can say, even if you accept Hume's premise that the laws of nature have been exceptionless, which is also a claim we're going to doubt, but right, even if you do accept that, you still wouldn't necessarily be justified in believing that the laws of nature are going to hold tomorrow, or that the laws of nature will continue to be exceptionless. And this goes back to Lewis's point about the frame. It also works in reverse. Basically, claiming that the laws of nature hold a certain way now doesn't give you any reason for thinking they had to have held this way, particularly in the past, which is Hume's particular point. Now, Flew gets around this by basically arguing, okay, well, let's just kind of put Hume's skepticism to the side and evaluate this argument. But it is important here because Hume himself recognizes the challenges to induction. I have an essay, or a draft on an essay, called Logical versus Practical Reasons, which tries to basically argue that you can be pragmatically justified in holding to induction, even if you're not logically justified. But I just want to kind of put that out there because I've noticed this too. Now let's talk about Hume proving too much. Hume makes this claim: it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit that appellation. Fair enough. However, what Norman Geisler is arguing is that this proves we should not believe in a miracle, even if it did happen. So what Geisler is arguing is that Hume's argument is telling you that you should never believe that a miracle occurred, even if it did occur. As a result, Hume is arguing for an epistemology that is incapable of tracking truth, or at least seriously considering truth. If a miracle actually occurred, right, what sort of evidence would you expect to find for it? Well, you'd expect to potentially find human testimony or maybe some sort of personal experience, something like that. Now, notice how Hume rules out human testimony a priori in favor of uniform experience. And not just uniform experience, but uniform experience which is also itself based on human testimony. So this is where I think Hume proves too much and also commits special pleading. Hume's argument basically argues you shouldn't believe in miracle claims, right? And if we establish that Hume's argument is question begging, we show that, according to Lewis's point, he does not prove that they cannot happen. So what Hume then is, not what he's left arguing, is basically that you should not believe in miracle claims even if they did occur. If we're legitimate truth seekers, we should reject Hume's epistemology because it is incapable of seriously considering the evidence. It is incapable of actually considering whether or not a miracle actually occurred, because it argues you're not justified in believing a miracle even if a miracle did occur, which is why I'm saying we should not accept an epistemology that's incapable of considering the truth of things that are possible. Now let's talk about Hume's ignorance of science. This is the fourth point. This is not meant to be a knock on Hume. When I say ignorance, I do not mean this in a pejorative way. I just mean Hume was basically doing the best he could with knowledge at the time, but now we know better, and we should basically do better because we know better. And I think as a result, this really does undermine Hume's overall point and one of his premises. So let's write Hume's argument as a syllogism. Premise 1 is nature behaves according to fixed natural laws described by physics. Premise 2 is a miracle would be a violation of natural laws, and as a result, a miracle is impossible given our knowledge of physics. And where you're going to push back on this is say that modern science, including and especially quantum mechanics, shows that premise 1 itself is false. It just completely undermines this. This is because Hume's understanding, and this is the historical case, is held in reference to an outdated Newtonian and therefore Laplacian nature of the world. So, right, Newtonian mechanics, force equals mass times acceleration, these sorts of things. But then the Laplacian part comes in assuming that everything is sort of causally determined, that there's no uncertainty or randomness in the universe. And there are a lot of scholars who have actually taken issue on this. Lewis has done so on miracles, and Alvin Plantinga has looked at this as well in his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. So what you can do is restructure Hume's argument given his understanding like this, right? Premise 1, nature behaves according to natural laws described by Newtonian physics. Premise 2, a miracle would be a violation of Newtonian natural laws. And the conclusion is, therefore, a miracle is impossible given our knowledge of Newtonian physics. Of course, given quantum mechanics, we now deal with probabilities and not laws of nature. So premise 1 is actually demonstratively false, and Hume's argument fails simply by his understanding of science. And as a result, his approach is flawed because it uses a debunked picture of reality that scientists no longer agree to. And consider this, right? Consider what the implications of quantum mechanics are. If you've never studied quantum, then here's a weird result. We describe things in terms of probabilities and not fixed laws. And you can actually, in part, thank Reverend Bayes for this, because they use Bayesian formulations to do this. It is not impossible for me to run through a solid wall. To claim that such a thing is impossible is simply just saying that it is very, very highly improbable. But given quantum tunneling, there is a very small probability that it is possible that I run through a solid wall. And you can actually calculate what this probability is. Now, it's really minuscule, but the fact is it is not logically impossible. It is simply improbable. So Hume's argument does not rule out the possibility of miracles. Now, you could argue it. You have to make a much weaker case, is what I'm trying to say. You have to argue, well, maybe it makes miracles seem improbable, but by ruling it out as impossible, you can now talk about improbable given the frame that you're working in with no assumed supernatural intervention. And what I would say is, yeah, modern defenders of Hume's argument actually need to reconcile this. They need to reconcile Hume's argument in terms of randomness. And Lewis makes an interesting point that randomness itself is not really a natural thing. Like, what is randomness? And what is the relationship of randomness to information? And to what extent can information be naturally reduced? These are difficult questions that that Hume himself was not aware of just because of his historical context. The other thing that modern defenders of Hume's argument need to reconcile is actually the failures of induction too. And this goes into some philosophy of science by people like Karl Popper, which is basically like, this was inspired by Hume, right? There are things that have happened where we assume that that things behave a certain way and we can make a law based out of this. But people have kind of moved away from doing these laws because these laws have been shown to be false. And as a result, this leads to actually skepticism of scientific truth. Not the existence of scientific truth, but whether our current understanding of science is true, given that our understanding of science has been wrong in the past, right? People used to believe, like Hume did, that the Newtonian picture of science was correct. And yet this turned out to be false. There were cracks in this understanding, and there were inconsistencies, and this eventually led to the development of new sciences that are not the same as the Newtonian picture. The other thing I want to say is induction itself is self-defeating, right? We know by induction that we cannot rely on induction itself because induction has been wrong. For instance, induction led to people thinking that all swans had to be white because all swans observed in Europe were white. Then a Dutch explorer found that there was a black swan or black swans in Australia, which means if you can't use induction as a means for finding truth because induction itself has been wrong in the past. So you can't trust induction by induction. The last thing I'm going to talk about is Hume's ignorance of probability theory. Now, this is not the place to go into Bayes' rule or probability theory, but you should really learn it because it's really, really important and very influential. A lot of scholars have made this point that Hume's argument really does need to be made in favor of the responses, particularly by Price and Bayes. I know Ehrman makes this response in particular, and many others do as well. So Reverend Bayes was a Presbyterian minister, and he actually developed Bayes' rule in response to Hume's argument against miracles. Bayes did a lot of work, and then Richard Price was kind of the one who formulated it and published it. And the cool thing was, this was actually developed as an argument for the resurrection of Jesus. Like, this is where Bayes' rule comes out of, right? Bayes was also a statistician, and seems like a pretty smart dude too. So he did this. Hume and Price were actually friends, and this was the cool thing. This is what gave me a lot of respect for Hume. And Hume and Price would write to each other. And Hume actually wrote back to Price, given his essay, "I own to you that the light in which you have put this controversy is new and plausible and ingenious, and perhaps solid. But I must have some more time to weigh it before I can pronounce this judgment with satisfaction to myself." Now notice Hume's epistemic virtue. Look at how both humble he is and the fact that he's willing to consider the evidence. This is why I really respect Hume. He's a true skeptic. He's willing to look at his argument in favor of the evidence and in favor of new arguments and new sorts of things. So this is why I say Hume's argument itself is a contribution. Hume put down an argument, there was a reply, there's been more work. Now it led to, by this sort of clashing of titans, led to all this new awesome stuff that we now get to use in engineering. Hume himself saw merit in Price and Bayes' response, and pretty much all other scholars I've read basically agreed. I don't think I've read anyone that's like, no, Hume's argument it doesn't need to be considered in favor of Bayesian statistics. I've never read a single scholar who says that. In fact, they pretty much all tend to say, yeah, Hume needs to reformulate his argument against miracles in light of this, which he never did. And Bayes makes the case. He makes basically the case that in terms of conditional probabilities, by conditioning on the existence of past evidence, you can actually overcome probabilities for induction. And this was done, of course, before the quantum mechanics picture in the first place. So even given fixed laws, you can potentially make an argument, an evidential case for something, given different evidences that you have that kind of sum together. That's what Price and Bayes did in response to the resurrection of Jesus, basically making the argument that, hey, given the fact that we have different witnesses and this, you can actually make a probabilistic case that Jesus' resurrection was probable given or conditioned on the evidence, which is Bayes' contribution. And of course, this idea of conditioning on events as a framework is great. We're having fun here. So, what I've done was hopefully point out some of the problems in Hume's argument. What I want to do now is, for the people that are watching this video that really do like Hume's argument, point out what needs to be done to save or resuscitate Hume. What do we need to do? Now, what I pointed out are the reasons why perhaps Ehrman and others consider Hume's argument not just a failure, but an abject failure. But I don't actually agree. I think Hume's argument does have interesting merit, does bring up a lot of serious issues. So let's talk about what can be done to Hume's argument, or what the contemporary scholar needs to do to fix Hume's argument and strengthen the gaps. First is you actually need to somehow rescue induction. And you need to rescue induction in favor of induction's own failure and self-defeating nature. And this is where my paper comes in, right? It can't be done logically, but perhaps you can make a pragmatic case for it. But the extent to which pragmatism is a solid ground for epistemology is very, very controversial. And that's where I would push back at the person trying to rescue induction, because Hume's argument itself rests on the very induction he was skeptical of. Number two, you actually need to defend scientific realism. Now, this is also related to induction, but somewhat similar. This is a new moved goalpost. Basically, we did not know scientific realism was something that had to be called into question. This is a more contemporary development, which is basically the idea that, can we trust the results of the scientific method to produce ontological or epistemically relevant truths? It was fine to believe this when science didn't produce conflicting models and revise its own knowledge, when our knowledge of science was elementary enough that we just had a Newtonian picture. But now we realize that we have been wrong about scientific results in the past, and even recognizing that our current scientific knowledge is likely flawed or incomplete. So we need to defend the fact that Hume's argument itself rests on scientific results which themselves are provisional, which is something that people were not aware of back then. So this is another thing that needs to be done, right? If you're going to rest the argument against miracles on scientific knowledge, you have to explain why we should trust scientific knowledge in the first place. 3, you need to reconstruct the argument in terms of quantum mechanics, not fixed laws of nature, which are shown to be false, but improbability and these other ideas that potentially make many of the miracle stories that we see in religious traditions a possibility. And lastly, what you need to do is take into account Bayesianism and modern probability theory, which also includes Bayesian epistemology. Once again, Hume is not aware of this. He plays fast and loose with the term probability. Now we have a much more structured and arguably better view of what probability means, deeper understanding of it. We need to be sure we're writing Hume's argument against miracles in light of these recent discoveries, or I guess, I don't know if they're recent, but in light of the subsequent discoveries of Bayesian statistics. So anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and let me know. Let me know if you like Hume's argument or not, whether you think it's an abject failure, if you would strengthen it. Keep on thinking. Have a good one.